Very good. Well, we might get a kick-off. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name's Callum Thompson, and I'm hosting this event on behalf of New South Wales Farmers. We might just go through a little bit of housekeeping first, and I think one of the important ones is if you could keep your mics off unless you're talking or obviously presenting. That just stops some of the background noises for everybody else listening. But feel free to put your video on. If you've got the bandwidth to be able to handle that, there's nothing worse than speaking to or presenting to a black screen. So feel free to put your screens on and we'll know if you're awake or not, if we have to be a little bit more animated. You can use the buttons on the bottom of your screen to both mute and unmute yourself and to turn your screen on. If you have any technical issues, there's also a button for chat, and you can send a message direct to myself or to Maria, and we'll help you with any technical issues. We're going to use Slido for our questions and answers, so that's the ideal way to put any questions in that you have through the night. But if you can't get Slido to work, or you don't have your mobile phone with you, or if you're watching this on your mobile phone, feel free to just use the chat box as well. I think we've got most people on, so we might kick off officially. Jonathan, would you like to introduce tonight?
Thanks, Cal. Hello, my name is Jonathan Tuckfield and I'm the Regional Service and Sales Manager at the New South Wales Farmers Association. This evening I'm in Young and I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wiradjuri people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. This event is a collaboration between New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and New South Wales Farmers, with support from the Farm Business Resilience Program funded through the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. We hope you find the information in this evening's event useful and can take some of the things you'll learn and implement them in your own farm business. First, tonight we'll hear from Chris Warwick. Chris is currently the National Coordinator for the GRDC Grain Storage Extension Project. Chris has been delivering information on grain storage to growers for the past 12 years. With a Bachelor of Business in Farm Management from Marcus Oldham College, Chris has held roles as a research officer based in Wagga Wagga and Toowoomba with the Condinan Group before moving into management consulting. Operating as his primary business, Chris now advises and assists farming businesses as an independent management consultant based in Horsham, Victoria. Then we'll hear from Andrew Free. Andrew runs a 5,500 hectare property near Gilgandra with his parents David and Sue and brother Mark. His investment in on-farm storage had less to do with luck and much more to do with the clearly designed and implemented management strategy that is now paying him and his family big dividends. Andrew is a 2015 Nuffield Scholar and 2014 Australian Grain Leaders Program graduate. Back to you, Callum.
Thanks, Jonathan. So what I'm going to do first, everybody, is just give you a rundown in Slido. So bear with me while I try and make that work. Apologies, my internet seems to be a bit slow with this coming up. So we'll use Slido to do our questions and answers, and I'm also going to ask you a few questions on it too. But while I wait for this to load, I'll just run you through. This is the 4th event in a series that we're running as we've mentioned, in collaboration with New South Wales DPI and New South Wales Farmers. And bear with me because this is not working as well. Technical issues are always great when you're doing these sort of things. So this is the 4th event, and we're focusing very much on infrastructure and things that you can invest in on your farm. that can improve profitability and prepare you for natural disasters such as floods, bushfires, and even things like the mouse plague that we dealt with last year. We've heard about tools that you can use to make decisions on what to invest in through our financial webinar. We've looked at ways to make decisions on fertilisers. We've heard about improving pasture and re-establishing pastures. Today we'll look at grain storage options, and on Friday we'll be at Wilcannia speaking about infrastructure for managing your large paddocks, so fencing and water infrastructure. These events are all being recorded and you'll be sent links to those recordings. So I really encourage you to go back and have a look at some of those webinars. I think there's been some really good information through those, and yeah, you'll get a lot out of it, especially treating it as a group of webinars that are all interlocking. So you've got a Slido question. It looks like a few of you have used Slido before because you're able to get on there and start answering some questions straight away. So you can either use your phone to scan the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and put in the event code, which is New South Wales Farmers. So our first question is, what is your closest town? We've had a few already put towns in. I think we've got, I'm just seeing how many people have answered. We've had 6 people put their answers in. 7. So we've got a good spread throughout New South Wales, which is great to see. So I'll go to our next question. And this question's about a bit more about you. So we really want to know what you want to get out of today. So what are some of your issues? What do you want to know more about? So grain storage options, that's great. I reckon we'll definitely cover that one. We will give you a bit of time because there's, yeah, you can, you might be a bit like me and a bit slow typing on the phone rather than the keyboard. So grain storage pests, that's a great one. Fumigation and aeration. Fertiliser storage. Chris, I don't think that's something that we discussed, but maybe something that you could add something to. Benefits and pitfalls, where to start. It's a great one.
Calvin, can I jump in quickly?
Yeah, for sure.
Just wondering the question around fumigation and aeration, if there's any more information on that, if the person that asked that question could provide any more detail on that, would be great.
So we've also got in the chat risk management is another option. Investment returns. Very good. Well, there's some great options there. If headspace fumigation. Very good. So I'll go to the next question. The next question is how long to generally store your grain. So, yeah, you may not store grain on farm. You might set it direct off-farm silos only while harvesting up to 6 months, up to 12 months, 12 months or 2 years, and then over 2 years. So often that'd be conserving for drought situations. Very good. So we've got, a fairly large percentage of people who don't store their grain on farm, and then a mixture of 6, 12, and up to 2 years. So next question is, what methods do you use for grain storage? So whether they're on-farm silos, grain bags, field bins, bunkers, pits, sheds, again, silos off farm or another option. And I think from memory, you can pick more than one of these if you have a few different storage options that you use on farm or use currently. So it looks like we've got majority of people are using silos on farm. There's quite a few people using grain bags. There's quite a few people using sheds as well. Yeah, I think someone's using, we're using all of those different options. And so this question's more about what storage options would you like to use or be interested in knowing more about? So silos and bunkers, getting quite a few votes already. Off-farm silos. And I guess in off-farm silos, I probably should have explained this to start off with, but I was thinking things along the lines of grain corps and those sort of silo systems, but there's a few private players in that space as well. So yeah, very much around silos on farm and bunkers, Chris. Very good. Well, thank you for sharing that information with us. That makes our job so much easier when we're presenting to you and knowing who we're presenting to. So as we're listening to tonight's speakers, it's worth remembering that they're speaking from their own experience and that of their clients, and they're not here to tell you really how you have to store your grain. They're here to give you some ideas on options that may be suitable for you. So like all the events that we've held, they're really a learning experience, so you can learn from others and take away some of their experiences to put into your own farm. So Chris, I'm going to throw to you. I'll stop sharing my screen if you'd like to share yours, and we can get started.
No problem. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great. Thanks for that intro and setting the scene, Callan. That was really good. And as we spoke earlier on the phone today, I love getting the questions up front so that I can tailor what we're going to spend the most time on today. There's no point me doing a presentation and not answering your questions. That's what you're here for, to hopefully get your questions answered. So please feel free to keep the questions coming. Throw your hand up, put them in the chat box. And I'll ask Callan to pull me up if there's a question there. I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, so please chime in if there's a question as we go. I don't mind being interrupted at all. There's my contact details if you do have questions after today, or think of something that you'd like to follow up on, or if you'd like to do a grain storage workshop in person now that we can. more than happy to come and travel through your region. In fact, I was through there last weekend, drove Horsham up to Toowoomba, so more than happy to come up and do workshops with you guys, and we can really get into the specifics of your grain storage needs, your situation, what may or may not work, and as Callan said, learn from what other people have experienced. So, drought preparedness, what are we really talking about? It's a bit of a catchphrase word at the moment, drought preparedness. I think it's a potentially a little bit offensive to some growers. That's why we farm. We know we're going to be hit with drought. We farm in Australia. But at the end of the day, it's really about being profitable over the long term. So one of the ways we can do that is either store our produce to gain a higher price, or we can store our inputs to be able to source them at a lower price. So if we're a net seller or a net buyer of grain, doesn't matter. We can use storage for both purposes, both on the selling side or on the buying side if we're buying grain in for feed. Obviously, we can use grain storage for cash flow management, of course, to hold grain through financial years, or it might be that it helps our cash flow in other ways, but it's a commonly I hear that's a consideration. Put stress and opportunity on there as well. I think I've done the numbers, return on investment for some growers, and it comes out that really grain storage is not the best investment for them. And they turn around to me and they said, Chris, look, I appreciate the numbers. Grain storage is not the best investment, but the pressure I feel at harvest, I'm going to invest in some storage just for my own personal well-being so I can actually sleep at night. So it's not all about the dollars and cents. Some of it is about managing your own stress levels and giving you some options there. So, and what I'm talking about opportunities, the guys that do well with grain storage that I see doing well are the ones that are able to choose when they sell their grain or choose when they buy. And so having that opportunity to be able to store grain when the price is low, or buy it in when the price is low, and store it and use it when it's when the price is high, or sell it when the price is high. Typically, what we're seeing now, and it was reflected as well in the question up front, instead of people storing grain for 3 to 6 months, as we used to, just for harvest logistics and sell to the domestic market, we're seeing a lot more people store grain for a lot longer than they used to. So it's quite typical that we see grain stored for 12 months to up to 3 years. And that's really changed the emphasis on being able to manage the grain over the longer term. That also fits in with storing grain for drought. We don't expect a drought every 6 months. We expect a drought every few years. So if we're going to store grain as part of our drought strategy, we need to expect that we're going to have to store the grain for a number of years. So making sure when we do go to the silo or the pit or the bunker to pull the grain out, it's in the quality that we need it to be. Ultimately, that's about having control over your business, having control over your inputs, control over your marketing, your pricing. And then, of course, there's sustainability and animal welfare, having grain on hand for our livestock. They go without saying, but I'll say them anyway. So what are we talking about? Grain storage management really boils down for me to avoiding mold and insects. So how do we either prevent it or how do we deal with it if it does happen? They're the two primary things that we don't want to happen in our stored grain, regardless of the system or the purpose we're storing for. They're the two things that we're really focused on not having pull us up. So prevention options, hygiene, obviously starting with a clean storage, both from a hygiene and contaminants, but mostly in terms of making sure there's not insects in and around the storage before we put grain into it. It's often overlooked how important and how much of a difference hygiene and structural treatments can make. Protectants, what I'm talking about in terms of protectants is the spray-on products. Some people are not aware that the spray-on products now are only designed to prevent insects from infesting the grain. They're not not designed to kill insects that are already in grain. So they're a protectant. They're a bit like in the same way that you might use Aerogard to keep mosquitoes away. They're trying to prevent the infestation. It's not like a fly spray that's going to kill the insects once they're already there. So protectants require forward planning. You can't afford to just store grain and hope for the best. And if you get insects, go to the shop and buy a liquid to spray on. We don't have those products anymore. Aeration cooling is another prevention option, both for mold and for insects. So the cooler temperature, obviously the less likely we've got mold to want to grow. And the cooler the temperature, the slower the life cycle of the insect. So if they are in there, you can even slow their breeding down to a point they can't breed anymore, they stop. It also creates an unwelcoming environment for insects to come and infest the grain if it's cool. So aeration cooling is a really good tool there. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end. And I'm glad to see some questions on it. I think it really is underutilised in a lot of cases. Monitoring, obvious one, again, often overlooked. Monitoring is about checking that the grain is doing what you expect it to do, and that is not changing in storage. So making sure if there is an issue that we get onto it quickly and that we don't lose quality over time. Of course, then if something does go wrong or we have a bit of bad luck, we don't get all those things right, we need a control option for our fumigation. So we need a control option for insects, and that is fumigation. On farm, we've got access to phosphine as the common one, or we can get a commercial fumigator to come and use other products for us. So I often get calls from growers through the 100 Weevil number. They ring me up, Chris, I've got insects in my storage. I just went to outload some barley, I went to feed it, and it's full of insects. What do I do? Well, first question I've got is, have you got any gas tight sealable storage? If you have, great, you can do a fumigation. If you don't have any gas tight sealable storage, your options are really limited. So being prepared, expecting that you will have to fumigate at some point, means you need some gas tight storage to be able to fumigate in. If anyone's got, I won't go into the detail of it today, but if anyone has got any questions about, well, what is gas tight? What are you talking about there, Chris? How do I know what's gas tight and what's not? Happy to expand on that individually. So we're talking about mold and insect management. How do the different storages compare? How well can we prevent mold and insects or deal with them in the various storage options that we've got? Obviously, the cone bottom or the flat bottom silos give us a good opportunity to do hygiene. The flat bottom silos slightly harder to do hygiene, but still possible. Protectants you can use in these. Aeration cooling, ideal to use in these. And by the way, aeration cooling is something you can retrofit. You can add it to existing storage to improve your management ability there. And monitoring, you can do monitoring provided you've got ladders. So I know a number of manufacturers are pushing people away from ladders because of the cost and the OH&S risk. That's understandable. Be aware that if you want to do monitoring, if you want to see what's going on in that grain storage, you need a safe way to get to the top. So if you have a line of silos, even consider a ladder at one end and an elevated platform, but you will need to get to the top. It's another common phone call I get. Chris, I think I've got insects, but I can't get up to the top of the silo and have a look. What do I do? Options are limited, so it's thinking ahead. Fumigation, I've got a question mark there. You might be thinking, why? I can fumigate, I can use phosphine in silos, can't I? You can if it's sealable to the Australian standard. If it's gas tight sealable, that is, that'll meet a pressure test. You can use phosphine. If you use phosphine in unsealable storage, you might give a few insects a headache, but what you will do is breed resistance really quickly, and you won't kill the eggs, larvae, and pupae in that insect life cycle. So you might get a potential short-term fix, but you'll get a long-term headache. Sheds, someone asked about sheds. Hygiene we can do, protectants we can do, they're great in a shed. Be aware that for protectants, they do break down with UV. So if it's an open shed, open to the sunlight, your protectant may not last as long. Aeration cooling is possible in sheds. They can be set up. I've seen a few great systems in sheds with aeration cooling. Monitoring we can do. Fumigation, I've put across there, while it is possible, it is so difficult to put a tarp over a shed or to get a shed that is actually gas tight sealable to hold fumigation, that it's really not practical for most people. I've just got a question here. What's the minimum pressure you need to reach a gas tight? So when we talk about gas tight, it's not like a huge amount of pressure. It's only 250 pascals, so a lot less than 1 psi. And there's a pressure relief valve on the side of the silo. That's the way we tell whether we're actually holding pressure. So we pressurize the silo, watch the oil levels move in that pressure relief valve to 1 inch apart, which is 250 pascals, and we time for an existing silo should be over 3 minutes before that oil valve goes from 1 inch apart back to 1/2 inch apart. There's a really quick rundown on a pressure test, but happy to expand on that later. More temporary storages, and obviously cheaper from an investment point of view. We can get a quicker return on investment with these. Obviously, there's not much capital required up front for bags, bunkers, or pits. So from a return on investment perspective, these may seem attractive. My upfront warning for these types of storage is use them as they're intended and be prepared to manage them well. So the better you manage these types of storages, the longer you can expect to have grain sitting there. If your personality is that you want something you can set and almost forget, or you know you're not diligent at doing good preparation or monitoring, then be aware that you may get let down with the temporary type storages. These storages really require good preparation, good site selection. We're trying to keep vermin out, we're trying to keep moisture out. We've really got to be careful about where we put these storages. And then we've got to be on top of any issues. If there is any holes, if there is any leaks or water ingress, we've got to be onto them early so they don't become a disaster. So prevention options, hygiene, of course, we can do if we're diligent. Cleaning up, plenty of people tell me if they clean up as soon as they've filled one of these storages, the birds and mice don't find them as quickly. If you leave grain around when you fill the bag or the bunker or the pit, the wildlife soon learn what's under that tarp and they'll make a mess of it pretty quick. And of course you get the birds, the mice and the foxes chase them, and followed by kangaroos and pigs and sheep and everything else that gets in there. So fencing is also, of course, another option if you can keep those animals out. Protectants, I've got a question mark there. Protectants would be a fantastic option in these storages. But remembering most protectants are really designed for 6 to 9 months of storage. If we're talking about storing grain for drought, we're most likely wanting to hold the grain for a number of years. So the protectants might give us a good protection early on, which could be of benefit. Be aware it's not going to last for years though. Aeration cooling. Again, I've got a question mark there. I've seen people set up aeration cooling in bunkers, diligent operators, so that's possible. Haven't seen aeration work in a bag, and I haven't seen aeration used in a pit. So bunkers possible, bags and pits, not sure. Monitoring, again, different for each of these. Of course, you can lift a bunker, you can put a hole in a bag and do your monitoring, pull a grain sample out. Pits, I typically don't see people monitor. They're more of a close up and hope for the best approach. So monitoring is possibly a bit harder there. Fumigation, so what if we do get an issue in one of these storages? Yes, you can fumigate in a bag if it's in good condition. If the bunker is set up well and you can seal the tarp down, it's possible to fumigate there. It's got to be done properly. It's not something you can pour a heap of grain on the ground, cover it with a tarp and come back 6 months later and go, oh, perhaps I might fumigate. You've really got to set the bunker up to be sealable so you can fumigate successfully. Someone asked about pits specifically. The people I see that do pits well, I've said it, but I'll say it again, site selection. is really key, having the right site so that you can keep water away from it. One of the real considerations with pits is to make sure that when you open them, you use the whole content of the grain that's in there. So once a pit is opened, don't expect to be able to close it back up again. That's where I see really, really disastrous results. So again, it's a combination usually. People have some silos. They might use some bags around the farm, part of their harvest logistics. If it's a big year, they might use pits, and that's their longer term storage for feed grain. But when they open the pit, they transfer it into their silo so they can use it as needed without risking water getting in there. We still don't know a heap about pits. Our expectation is that the ground temperature stabilises the grain temperature and cools it down, in effect, giving us that aeration cooling equivalent. But we really don't know. We don't have a heap of research on pits, so that's something we need to do some more work on. I said I'd talk about aeration cooling, and I'm glad someone asked about this as a management tool. Aeration cooling, we do some research every year on how much aeration cooling is used in the country, and it still surprises me how underutilised it is. Particularly in years like we had last year, we've got some over moisture grain. We can't expect to be drying grain with aeration cooling, but what we can do is hold it. So aeration cooling is enabling us to hold over moisture grain. It helps prevent pests. It prevents mold. It gives us the ability to blend high moisture and low moisture grain. And in legumes particularly, it helps us maintain grain quality. So there's many benefits there. And as I said, aeration cooling is something you can add to existing storage. So we know silos are really hard to get at the moment and getting more expensive by the day. If you're looking at improving your on-farm storage as a system, consider adding aeration cooling to it, whether that be adding the fans if you don't have them, or it might be adding an automatic controller if you don't have one of those, but you do have the fans. They'll operate the fans most efficiently for you for cooling. It's a combination, I think, of the grain moisture and grain temperature to prevent issues. So the drier the grain, the less emphasis on cooling. But if you're trying to push the limits on grain moisture at harvest, the colder you can get the grain, the less issues you're likely to have. I had plenty of phone calls this harvest, as you expect. People trying to get harvest off in not harvest conditions. Ring me up, Chris, I've got grain, it's slightly over moisture, I can't deliver it. What do I do? What options have I got? If they had aeration cooling, they had options. They could hold the grain until they got some dry grain off, and they could blend the over moisture grain with the dry grain and then deliver it. Seeing more and more of that happening. In fact, a lot more of that happening than people trying to dry grain down that's over moisture. Blending is a far more cost-effective way to manage slightly over moisture grain for most people. So having aeration cooling enabled them to do that. Yeah, it just gives you options, gives you flexibility. Once grain is cold, or whatever temperature grain is for that matter, it will hold it for a number of months. There's research being done, plenty of research and examples of grain going into storage at harvest temperatures, mid 30 degrees. It will hold that temperature for months. Even when it cools down in winter, the grain temperature will still be quite warm. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was doing some work measuring the temperature of grain bags down here in Victoria. The grain near the edge of that bag was down as low as 13, 14 degrees, but I put my spear into the center of the bag, and our average ambient temperature, I think, was about 15, mind you. The grain temperature in the middle of that bag was still at 22 degrees, even after months of cold weather. So grain will hold its temperature very well. I've got a question. I'm just looking here. What's the minimum standard for thickness tarps? That's a question I'll have to come back to. Minimum thickness of plastic tarps. There is, if I'll go back to it, Some guys I hear use just a thinner plastic underneath bunkers and a good quality tarp over the top. Others I hear use the top tarp for a few years. Once it starts getting a bit weathered in a few holes, they'll then downgrade it to become the bottom tarp. I have heard a number of people tell me in their experience, if you're going to put a bottom tarp under a bunker or in a pit, make sure it's watertight. Absolutely has to be watertight. If you're going to put a tarp underneath a bunker or a pit, the top tarp has to be watertight. You have to keep water away from it, because if you get any water ingress, you're going to hold it in there with your bottom tarp. Some people actually prefer for the pits to not put any bottom tarp in, so that if water does get in, it'll seep out again. But that can be dependent on your soil type and water holding capacity and drainage and a few other things. But something to be aware of. It's not all about just putting a tarp in and throwing the grain in. Think ahead a little bit. If I do get water in here, how's it going to get out? Having a little bit of slope on your storage can also help, so that if you do get water in, it's going to run to one end or even out one end. It's the flat ground that brings people unstuck, particularly in years like we're having at the moment.
Chris, just on tarps, I know a producer I do some work with around Dunedoo, it was very clear to say that you don't use concrete tarp that you might get from your hardware store for either top or bottom.
Yeah, I'd expect that's pretty thin stuff. We've got to be realistic about what we're trying to expect this plastic to do, whether it's on the bottom, running over sticks and rocks, and the front end loader's got to run over it to outload. We're going to rip it up pretty quick. And the top, we're obviously dealing with, got to be UV stable, and we've got to prevent birds putting holes in it really easy, and vermin, as well as the wind effect. We often overlook the pressure that wind can put on those tarps when they start flapping. Back to aeration cooling. I've gone a roundabout way, but back to aeration cooling. So I've talked about the benefits. I thought it would be worth clarifying, and if we had a question about aeration, I'm talking about 2 to 3 litres or 2 to 4 litres of air per second per tonne. So cooling doesn't require high airflow. It's quite low airflow really, and that'll cool grain just fine. In fact, once the grain's cooled down, you can even reduce that flow rate depending on your system. If we're wanting to dry grain, we need upwards of 15 litres of air per second per tonne. So don't be confused that we've got a bit of aeration here. We'll try and do some grain drying. If you only set up for cooling, you don't expect to go drying grain. I hear the occasional scenario, Chris, people say, Chris, you know, that's rubbish. I've got a little aeration cooling system and I've been able to dry grain with it. On the odd occasion, you might, if it's just surface moisture on a bit of grain and you've got a really high capacity aeration cooling system, or you've only part filled the silo, you might get away with a little bit of drying, but it's not something that I'd reliably say go and try and do. So if part of our strategy is to do early harvest, or to be able to take grain off when the moisture is high from whatever event, if aeration drying is something we want to look at, we need high capacity fans to do it. And when you look at the amount of moisture you need to carry out of the grain to actually dry it, it soon starts making sense why we need high airflow to carry that moisture out. And to carry the moisture out of not just the grain at the top of the silo, but the grain that's right down the bottom, we have to carry the moisture out of that grain, past the grain in the middle of the silo, past all the other grains and right out the top. And to do that without wetting up and creating wet spots in the silo, we need high airflow. So be aware when we talk about aeration, it's either aeration cooling or it's aeration drying, one or the other. Majority of cases, and the cheaper and easier option is aeration cooling. That gives us our initial benefits. If we want to set up for aeration drying, that's a whole nother ball game. I thought it'd be worth letting you guys know some research that we're working on at the moment, which is of particular interest given the season we've just had. We've had some anecdotal evidence that falling numbers could be improved if grain's put into storage. So we hunted around, couldn't find any scientific evidence of this, any research, any data on it. So very quickly this harvest, we collected a heap of grain samples and we're testing them every few weeks to see whether falling numbers can be improved with grain in storage. And what might influence that? Is it just time? Is it temperature? Or is it, do you need to dry grain out or something like that to affect falling numbers? So watch this space. That could be some interesting results coming up soon. Doing some research on how bags could be vented after fumigation. We know a method to reliably fumigate bags, but we haven't found a great method to be able to vent bags if you don't have power. So looking at options there as well. And that's becoming an issue with bulk handlers now testing for fumigant residues. So they're testing phosphine levels in grain as you deliver it. If you haven't done venting correctly, expect to be turned around. Also doing some research on what aeration capacity is needed for various grains. A lot of the research in the past has been done on wheat. We obviously grow a heap more grains than wheat, so doing some research on that. Another one we're looking at, and is quite topical, is monitoring equipment in silos. Can it handle phosphine fumigation? We know that some equipment, particularly the relative humidity sensors, so the moisture sensors, actually get destroyed by phosphine. So before you go investing in monitoring equipment, keep an eye out for that research results that we expect to come out in the next few months. And the other one, last one there on the list is diatomaceous earth, still working as a structural treatment. So Dryaside, as many of you would know it, has been around for a while, and there's a number of other brands, so I've just put them all through their paces to test whether they're still effective and whether there's any differences in efficacy between the brands. So that's just to give you an overview of what work we're doing. And if you'd like a workshop for more information, or you want to keep in touch and find out these results, please do so. Happy to share them. And likewise, if you've got questions that I can't answer, I'll add them to our list of potential research topics. It's something we're really focusing on at the moment, trying to answer the questions that you guys are bringing to us. So the key points I'd like you to go home with: remember that drought storage is long-term, and the management of that is therefore imperative. It's no longer about buying a couple of silos, filling them up for a rainy day. We've got to take it more seriously than that, which many of you do an excellent job. So it's about managing our expectations. If we want to pull the grain out in the same quality, we've got to actually do the management right so that we don't have surprises at the end. Aeration cooling, I think I've done my best to sell you on that. I'm not a salesman, no vested interest in it, but I think it's really underutilised for a lot of people, the benefits that aeration provides and the options that you can have, particularly in a wetter harvest. Watch this space on new research. And again, if you guys would like to do more on grain storage, happy to come up and run a workshop. I've done one with Andrew and my former colleague, Pete Botter, who's passed away a few years ago, very sadly, has done a lot of work in your area as well. But we're here to help your levies through the GRSC fund us to do this work. So please feel free to make use of it. We can come and add to your specific questions. Slide there, the Grow Notes Grain Storage Manual. We used to have a heap of fact sheets and booklets. They've all been combined into one manual on grain storage. It's got QR codes in it for more information, videos, how-to guides. There's a template in there for return on investment, looking at the economics of on-farm storage. So feel free to grab a copy of that. There's a QR code there to download it. We can send you a hard copy if you'd prefer. Feel free to get in contact with us. that's a wrap from me. Callum, happy to take questions either now or at the end, whatever would work best with your format.
Yeah, Chris, I think we've got time for maybe one or two questions. Mark's just asked, is the workshop intended to be with a group of producers in a local area, or is it intended to be a one-on-one site visit?
It intended to be a group. Happy to do small group, large group. If you've got your specific questions, of course, I'll hang around after that group session, or if you put your hand up to have the workshop at your place, I'm more than happy to come along and look at your situation one-on-one as part of that event. And
Andrew's just mentioned that storedgrain.com.au is a great resource, and we'll make sure that that website address is sent out with the recording. I think we've got time for just one more question. James has asked, can aeration fans be turned off during the winter months once grain is cool, or do they need to run all year?
Great question. Thank you, James. You've touched on something there that is, potentially. As we said, once we cool the grain down, it will hold that temperature very well. So the main purpose of running fans after the grain has been cooled is to make sure that the grain on the northern wall, particularly, and in the headspace that gets heated by the sun, stays cool. There's no point doing all this effort cooling our grain down and then letting the top 100, 200 mil and the northern wall grain heating up again and becoming an attractive spot for insects to come in and breed. So we don't need too much air through the winter, just enough to flush out that warm grain that's on the surface getting heated by the sun. If you're running an aeration controller, don't turn your controller off. Let the controller keep running so that it keeps track of where its moving set point is. If you do want to save electricity or save power in your generator, and you want to choose to turn your fans off for a couple of weeks each month, that's your call to do that. I agree with you that you probably don't need as much air through the winter, but just be aware of that northern wall and the headspace grain heating up.
Very good. Thanks, Chris. We've got a couple more questions coming in. Remember Slido for asking questions as well. We might just leave them till the end and throw across to Andrew. So, Chris, could you unshare your screen? And Andrew, would you like to share your screen?
All right. There we go.
So we can see his screen.
Very good. So I'll start. So thanks to Callum for pulling it all together. New South Wales Farmers and DPI certainly very much appreciated the opportunity to present, and particularly a guy like Chris, he's a great resource. So I know you've been firing some good questions, so keep on doing that. I've had the background, so that's us. We're based at Collie, right up the road from the famous Collie Hotel. We're a mixed cropping and livestock enterprise. The only other thing probably in my introduction is I've got a grain marketing price risk management background. So I suppose that sort of overlays my interest in the on-farm storage piece. And I was fortunate enough in 2015 to do a Nuffield Scholarship on-farm storage, but also supply chains. And that's something I will also touch on today, because often we're just thinking about harvesting grain and getting it off and putting it in storage, but it's also important to think about getting it to market. So that's something I'll touch on hopefully in the presentation today, which you'll find interesting. The other thing I'll mention before I get into the presentation, Nuffield Scholarships are currently open and open till the 22nd of June. So if anyone is interested in Nuffield, would like to know some more information about it, feel free to get in touch. I'll give my details at the end. But it's a fantastic opportunity. Sexually, I got the opportunity to travel overseas for 14 weeks. Got 30 grand support to support that travel and study, and certainly opened a lot of doors, and wouldn't be where I am today without it. What did I look at on my study? So I looked at not just storage piece, but moving grain to market, because if you're investing in a silo, you're doing your ROI, return on investment calculations, you're looking 30 years plus. So you've got to consider what your grain market might look like now, how your grain moves to market, but what it's going to look like down the track. And when I was travelled overseas, I looked particularly at the UK and Europe and North America, and the way their supply chains worked, and the way growers were storing in grain, and considered, right, well, what's relevant for us here? And maybe, look, that's what they do, but that works in their situation, but not for us. And also managing grain and store. And look, Chris is the he's the Bible on that sort of piece, but I'll just touch on a few things just practically that we've done on our farm. And you see those silos behind, though, the silos I had, some of the silos I had before I went away on the program. We've sort of changed and tinkered things, and I'll touch on some of the things we've done practically on farm as well. So here's the pretty typical US on-farm storage setup. They rely typically on pretty much just aeration and not so much on fumigating and gas-tight storage. So this is in Iowa, the Rich Farms. So they're looking at drying grain in a high moisture environment and then cooling. They've got a very cold winter, which helps them. And they don't necessarily have to rely on fumigation. So, that's a pretty typical American setup. And that's also, if you're looking at North American manufactured silos, they're built for that environment. So they're not necessarily all built to be gas tight. So that's something to keep in mind. Here are some trends. One of the great things about the Yanks is they're huge producers of grain. They've got probably the best supply chain. They collect all this data. So one of the things that had happened over there, we saw a lot of on-farm storage had been built over there, but really it wasn't increasing the percentage share of what was grown in the States. So the share, a bit over 55% was stored on farm, but both on-farm storage and off-farm storage was growing, was the trend. So here was one of the big new sites that I went to in Indiana. So this was a new site that was being built that could load a 2-mile, 3.2 kilometre train, 160 car units, 16,000 tonnes on one train. So when you think about a lot of the little trains we're loading are only 2,000 tonnes, that's, this is what the US are heading towards, particularly on their corn and beans in their main rail supply chain, on the supply chain network. And here's just that trend. Here's that chart. Basically, there's a trend towards longer trains moving the bulk, the bulk of their grain task. And that's something for us to consider too with inland rail coming on the East Coast is, what's the impact of that going to be? How's grain going to flow to market once that's built? And what does that mean for our storage investments? So we'll jump over the border into Canada. So here's a pretty typical, probably one of their newer ones. It's a pretty typical shuttle elevator. The Canadians are a long way from port, so road is not as competitive with rail as it is over there, and they've got quite an efficient rail network. So what they're left with is growers will store on farm and then truck into these elevator sites, which are quite efficient. So this particular site handled, close to 340,000 tonnes in that particular year, but the site was turned over sort of 8 to 9 times. This site only has storage for 40,000 tonnes. It's a bit like a toll site. So growers that cart grain in and to meet rail shipments. And so here was another one of the trends in Canada. Canada had closed virtually a lot of their older, smaller sites, but they had fewer and higher productivity rail loading sites to turn around these big trains. And so, here's just a little demo of what I had at the time. But, effectively, these really efficient sites can offer the grower a higher price. So the price draws tonnes away from the smaller sites. They close and you'll get, so they have more grain stored on farm and then carted into these efficient rail loading sites throughout the year. And that's just a little diagram of the state's rail network. So you basically got the Pacific Northwest over here with the Canadian and the white wheat and beans coming out here to Asia, and then you've got out through the Gulf. So you've got their barge network running down the Mississippi, and then out here into the Middle East and other Central American markets. So I'll skip over this. This is but I mean, effectively, this is, I'll go back one. This is what a lot of our rail network was built for, was when we used to cart grains like this in bags. And this is when grain growing was hard work. I'm glad I've grown up in the 80s and 90s and we're containerized. And I think this is the important thing to consider, is that whole investing in a silo. It's a 30-year time frame. So a lot of the infrastructure we've got now might not be what we've got in 10 to 20 years time. So, I think that's interesting. And here's our freight costs from, typical upcountry New South Wales sites to port compared to WA, compared to Canadian market. So moral of the story is there's plenty of room for improvement on the East Coast, and that will happen over time. It might not happen as quickly as what I would like or what many of us would like, but there is going to be a shift here, which will see rail being more cost competitive, particularly once inland rail goes in. So here, I'll skip over inland rail and leave some room for questions. And here's a good comparison too. What happens in Canada is basically you've got Vancouver, the main port on the west coast, handling the bulk of Canadian grain. So what you've got is, I think, 5 or 6 major, stevedores, ports, all set up which compete with each other. They're also very cost competitive and efficient because they have to be. Where in Australia, you've got a very fragmented port market because each little rail network feeds, one port or maybe 2 ports. So that port has virtually that whole rail market captive, where if you get something like inland rail going in, you might end up with a couple of sites being dominant ports. So rather than 1 or 2 operators at a port site, you might end up with 3 or 4 or 5 and creating more competition. So it's just some more implications of what inland rail might bring us. Here was one of the things I did post Nuffield. So Growerco, which is now unfortunately folded up, but was a co-op based in northern New South Wales, set up to look at some of the supply chain issues, which particularly over the last 12 months we've faced. And they're effectively trying to recreate some of the work that the Hunter Valley coal chain had done. And so, like when I travelled overseas, you looked at all these great, American, the Canadian and European rail networks and the way they move their grain. But one of the most efficient rail networks is the Hunter Valley coal chain, and can move product far more cheaply than what grain can. Some reasons why we can't do it as efficiently in grain as what they do in coal. But one of the things that did happen, which I think is interesting for us as grain producers, is that the coal operators were at a cliff face. The way they were doing it, they couldn't physically get any more coal out than they were. The only way they could get more coal out through the supply chain was to work together and coordinate. So rather than Glencore and BHP and Rio Tinto owning their own trains and moving all their own coal and their own trains to the port, they set it up in a centralised authority which coordinated all those rail movements, which let them increase the total volume of coal going out through the Port of Newcastle. And as a side benefit, they reduced their supply chain costs by $10 a tonne. So if anyone tells you that there isn't fat that can be taken out of the rail network on the East Coast, they're lying. There is huge opportunity to lower costs and make rail more competitive than it currently is. So here are a couple of other visits I went to. So here's some guys in the UK. These are big grain producers up in Cambridge, so up in sort of their main milling wheat growing area. And so for him, basically in his market, if he was harvesting grain that was dry enough, it made sense for him to store it on farm. if it was high moisture and didn't have the facilities to dry it, that's where he'd go into his cooperative facility. So the UK is basically a road market, so there wasn't a big price advantage in using centralised facilities. So that was one way of looking at it, right? If rail isn't competitive, basically he's storing grain on farm. Here's some guys in Canada. So this is Bev Hill and Jim Hill. I spent 3 or 4 days going around with these guys. So this is their great big storage network that had just evolved over time, and they had set up to virtually be like a local elevator. And the way they were competing with the big guys, Bunge and Cargill and Dreyfus, was through service. So that's the other piece, is the service that either you offer it yourself as a storage provider, or what your local storage operators. You can have a good site up the road, which is great, and you don't need your own storage. But there's plenty of examples when they're pretty ordinary too, and that can be a big reason why you'd want to build your own storage. And here's one of the things that a few people on this call, might not have sufficient storage or would like to invest, and go and talk with people who have put a system in or have experience in putting a system in, because you basically, could be a 10, 15-year time horizon to get to where you're going to go. So that planning is so important. I can't underestimate the importance of the planning. Now I'll skip over that for some questions. I'll talk a little bit about the keeping grain in condition stuff. And I think Chris mentioned aeration, and I completely agree with him that aeration is underused in Australia. One of the biggest things that we did on our farm post doing the scholarship was retrofitting our old storages with aeration. A lot of them we decided that it wasn't feasible to make them gas tight, but it certainly was economic for us to retrofit aeration and controllers, and that's one of the best things that we've done for our old existing storage, and that's made them quite useful. And with our new investments, we've put gas tight storage, which is made, as part of our whole house storage setup, has made it work a lot better. But I went to Purdue University, Kansas State. There's some really strong linkages with CSIRO here, GRDC, and what guys do in the US. One of the things is that if you store grain in bunkers, you're good at breeding bugs. So there's lots of research, and which Chris just had a smile at. But at grower land, hopefully went on in that space. But I guess the thing I did want to touch on here was this keeping grain in condition. That's one of the things that I see with aeration. The main role of aeration is that if you do have some moisture in your grain or storing grain for long periods of time, aeration is your best way to keep that grain in condition. So here's the example of when you do get it wrong. So that's a big lump of corn, wet corn that's blocked an outtake auger. Farmers climbed in to, what's going on? Climbed in. Next minute he's been trapped. You got ambulances, and this guy died, for example. So this is what happens when you get grain storage wrong. So never underestimate the importance of doing it right in the first place. You don't want to get into this situation. And Chris touched on it, the workshops that the GRDC guys do. So here's the late Peter Botter doing a presentation to some local farmers up the road in Gilgandra, them upskilling themselves, because if you're storing grain for a longer period of time, you need to upskill yourself and make sure your management is right. You have all the whiz-band infrastructure in the world, but if your management isn't right, you'll get into problems. And here was one of his charts, pretty simple chart. The longer you store the grain over time, the more risk there is of something going wrong, and that's where you need tools in your toolkit. So aeration is the biggie, I think, particularly if you're older existing storage, and then you need sealed storage to be able to outturn your grain pest-free. So recognising aeration keeps your grain in good condition, and sealed storage lets you fumigate to control pests. And there'll be some markets where that's more important than others. And aeration doesn't have to be fancy. So these are a couple of, here's one in Kansas. This is one of the biggest storage sites in Salina in central Kansas. Here's one in Ontario in Canada. Here's some in a shed. Here's some underfloor aeration, just the half moon ones. This is a really glamorous one. That's me doing some hygiene work, is cleaning out all the old crap from around the storage. And this is one of the easiest things you can do. It costs you the least amount of money to get your hygiene right and keep your storages clean. And there's the little storedgrain.com.au website. When I was doing my Nuffield report, the amount of information in there was fantastic. The other thing I'd touch on quickly, and this is not just for on-farm storage, but your business operations in general, but good management practices manage risk and maximise returns. And I know just having some pretty sample standard operating procedures around your storages on what to do and what not to do, and for that to be clearly defined with all the people in your business means that you get things right. So it's not an accident that your storages are clean to start the year. It's not an accident that your aeration is on and working. It's not an accident that you manage and monitor your grain over for pests over the year. These are just things that, righto, tick and flick, these get done. And if you do these, you can store grain effectively. I'll cut it off there, and hopefully that's hasn't gone too far over time and leaves a bit of room for questions. So pretty much we've done pretty much every storage option, haven't done a lot of bunker work, but we've done a bit of everything. We've done grain in pits, silo bags, we've got older storage with aeration, we've got new gas tight storage in our setup. So yeah, I'll throw it open for questions.
Thanks, Andrew. We've got a question here, and I think that we might throw that back to Chris. What's the withholding period for fumigation?
Good question. So we need to remember that can you hear me okay? Yep, just making sure I'm not still on mute. So when we do a fumigation, there's a venting period and a withholding period. So we need to remove the fumigation from the storage, then we need to vent it. If the silo has aeration, the venting by the label is 1 day, followed by 2 days withholding. If we don't have aeration, the label says 5 days, plus your 2 days withholding. What we are learning that in those bigger storages with cold grain, sometimes that venting is not long enough. The most reliable way to know if your grain is vented is to buy yourself a clearance meter or a personal phosphine meter, and you can actually test the grain before you outload it to check that the phosphine is fully vented. So 2 days withholding, that's after you've done your venting, either 1 or 5 days.
Thanks, Chris. Andrew, I've got one here for you. And it's a question, isn't inland rail containers only and the bogey limit built to budget and single line to get containers between Melbourne and Brisbane, not bulk like the USA and Canada?
Yeah, so yes and no. So the main business case is containers from Melbourne to Brisbane, but say in New South Wales, one of the biggest benefits for us is we'll get good mainline rail access to the Port of Newcastle and also Port Kembla. So, Newcastle will be a big beneficiary, and that will allow longer trains with heavy axle weights. So rather than running a 2,000 tonne train, you'll be easy running 5, 6, 7,000 tonne trains, and that will lower costs. So yes and no. It's designed primarily Melbourne, Brisbane containers, but there will be bulk benefits, particularly for us in central New South Wales into Newcastle, for example.
Thanks, Andrew. And Andrew, Chris, I'm not sure who of you'd like to take this one, but just jump in. Any insights on the profitability of long-term running costs of aeration versus spot fumigation?
Any comments, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I think when I did the rough calcs, it costs us about $10 a tonne to retrofit our old storage with aeration and a controller, which is very, very cheap in the grand scheme of things. And I think it's important to understand so with aeration, we're trying to keep grain in condition to be able to safely store it for 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. Particularly if it's a little bit, like Chris mentioned, if it's a little bit on the moist, like if you're around 13, 14, 15% moisture. But the role of being gas tight is being able to kill insects. So there's two separate things. If you're trying to stop mold or lumps, that's where you need aeration. If you're trying to manage a pest incursion and guarantee that your grain is pest free, that's where you need to be gas tight. And to be gas tight, the investment you need in good high quality storage, up front you're looking $200 a tonne plus for a new build. So it's more expensive to ensure your storages are gas tight. Peter Fodder mentioned that one of your goals should be is that whatever the most amount of grain you'd outturn in 1 month, have that as your target for the amount of gas tight storage that you have, and use your aeration for your 3 month, 6 month plus type long-term storages. If your hygiene is right up front, a lot of the time you're not going to get any pest incursion, but you've got that gas tight option as a fallback if you do get insects without having to bring in a fumigator to use Profume or something along those lines.
Yeah, well said, Andrew. Agree with all those points. You're really looking at aeration cooling, as you said, is only one benefit in its preventing pests. Aeration cooling does a whole range of things for you. So preventing mold, and we talked about moisture management, evening out moisture. If we've got years when we've got variable moisture in our crops, there might be some green grains coming in from wheel tracks and that sort of stuff. Aeration cooling will even that moisture out. So it's hard to do a direct comparison because phosphane's only got one job. It's only controlling insects. Aeration's got many jobs. In the grand scheme of things too, we're talking about a handful of dollars per tonne to run aeration cooling. And likewise with phosphane, it's less than $1 a tonne to fumigate with phosphane if you're doing it yourself. So in the grand scheme of what you're trying to achieve with storage, saving 50 cents here and 50 cents there, if it's that tight, you shouldn't be doing it, to be honest.
Thank you. So remember, everyone, you can put questions in through the chat or through Slido. Chris, just wondering, is there any issues showing up with insect resistance to any of the protectants or the fumigation?
Yeah, absolutely. You must have done some reading. There is growing resistance in both protectants and phosphine. In the protectants, they've been used for a lot of years. The chemistry is getting a bit worn out, but in terms of using protectants as a protectant, as a preventative, the two main choices we've got in KO Bile and Conserve Plus, they are still very effective as a protectant. So we can still rely on them. Of course, with all our chemistry, we want to rotate our chemical groups. That helps prolong the chemistry as long as we can. With phosphane, doing our fumigations in gas-type storage is our best way to prevent the resistance growing there. If we're talking about, should we do aeration or just keep bombing it with phosphine, repeated fumigations in unsealed storage is the quickest way to build resistance. If you suspect you might have resistance, you can get sampling done for free, and even use the commercial fumigators to come and use Profume to break that chemistry cycle. The other thing I would just mention quickly, Andrew touched on it too, having sealed storage. I want to clarify, when we're talking about sealed storage, we're really talking about sealable storage. We're not sealing it up to keep the insects out. We're not sealing it up for the whole time the grain is stored there. We only want sealable storage when we're fumigating. We only want to seal it up to keep that gas in. The rest of the time, the silo needs to be open or the storage needs to be breathing. I've seen a lot of disastrous storage. People buy a sealable silo thinking they're locking the grain up and sealing it up, and they get condensation forming and mold and start blaming the silo when it was a misunderstanding of why a silo needs to be sealed. The other thing I do want to touch on, it's really timely at the moment, and hearing Andrew's talk about your experiences with investing in storage for the long term reminded me about it. The wait times on silos now are usually more than 12 months. So as Andrew said, planning well ahead is really important. Unfortunately, what it means is if people want storage in a shorter term, they're being forced to go for brands that are not sealable because they don't have any other options. So they're going for a short-term gain of, okay, I'm going to get silos for this year, but that silo is going to be on your farm for the next 30 years. If it's not gas tight sealable, you don't have that option for the next 30 years. So I'd really encourage you to plan ahead. If storage is going to be part of your business, plan for it in advance so that you can get the quality that you need to. If you can't get the silos this year that you want, look at temporary storage for the interim until you can invest in quality.
That's a great point, Chris. Dave's got a question. Is there any difference in steel versus poly silos in terms of grain temp or any other benefits or negatives?
Yeah, good question. It's something we haven't done any research on that I'm aware of. There's been some research done on the colour of the silo. A white silo will reflect the temperature. I see some marketing literature around on the non-steel silos, poly silos, claiming to be a cooler. Haven't seen any research on it to confirm that. I haven't seen any really large scale poly silos either, so I'm not sure how large they're building them now. Something that you can do, we talk about aeration cooling. Another option that may work for a small amount of grain is actually to harvest it when the temperature is cooler. So if you're keeping seed or you want to keep some grain for the long term, even consider harvesting it in a cooler part of the day, because grain will hold that temperature for a long time. We know seed viability is significantly improved with a cooler temperature. So if your seed's going in your old silos that are not sealable, don't have aeration, consider harvesting your seed in a cooler part of the day. Simple stuff. As Andrew said, doesn't have to cost cheaper money, just a bit of fall planning.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we've got time for one more question. Pete's asked, just further to your comments on rail into Newcastle, are they upgrading rail into Newcastle as part of inland rail? Not sure if that's something you can answer, Andrew.
Yeah, so with the coal network, there already is high capacity dedicated line into Newcastle, so that part's not the issue. I guess our issue is up country is getting access to that main line, but then also currently in the New South Wales network, particularly up country, there's a lot of single points of failure. So you might have a signal breakdown or a train breakdown, which backlogs the whole network. Where if you have inland rail as a spine, you've got some of the other current lines which might be able to run an empty train back up country and remove some of that single points of failure. So rather than a train operator only being able to get 2 trips or 3 trips, or 1 trip or 2 trips a week up and back, they might be getting 5 or 6. So it's about it basically makes train more profitable, which lets them lower their costs. So and the other thing I was just going to mention with Chris on the choice of storage that you build, I think it's really important to consider something that's gas tight. If you're going to spend money on a storage, it might be gas tight in the first year that it goes in, but think about 5 and 10 years down the track. I mean, particularly some of the North American ones or the transportables, they might be fine in year 1 and year 2, but what about year 10 or year 20? They will not meet that gas tight standard. So if your intention is the storage to be gas tight, don't cut corners. And if you're looking at cost efficiency, aeration is one of the most cost efficient ways to do it. But just be careful of manufacturers that claim to be gas tight, but I can guarantee a lot of them in 5 or 10 years time won't be able to.
Very good. Well, I think that's it for questions. Chris, Andrew, I'd just like to thank you both for sharing your knowledge and your experience today. I know Andrew is fairly busy with trying to get crop in and juggle storms and rain and things like that. So yeah, I'd like to thank you both for sharing your time, and thank you guys for providing some really good questions. It's been a good bit of discussion coming out of that session. So our next the next part of tonight's webinar, we're just going to do a bit more Slido. So bear with me while I share my screen. So hopefully you've got Slido in front of you. Andrew, I can see you. Can you see Slido on your screen?
I can, yes.
Very good. Thank you. So I'm going to ask just a couple of questions. So as part of what we want to do tonight, and we've been doing this throughout our events, is trying to get a bit of more information from you guys about ways you think you could be preparing on farm for drought, and that might be, as I say, on farm preparation. It might be things you think support agencies need to do to help producers prepare for drought. It might be things that the industry might need to do. So I'll go to our first question, which is really what activities would support you prepare for drought. As I said, that can be on farm, it can be policy, it can be things industry can do. So I guess these answers will go back to New South Wales Farmers, and they'll also go back to DPI, so two agencies that very much help farmers in terms of extension and in terms of policy and research. So good one, fodder reserves on farm. I guess tonight we've been talking about grain, but yeah, there's also the importance of, as we saw through the last drought, that shortage of roughage. So forage reserves are very important. Soil conservation. I think most of the phone calls I received coming out of the drought were around soil conservation and how we could manage low ground cover and the amount of water that was coming out in those summer storms post-drought. That's another really good one. Confinement pens has come up quite a bit through this event, and talking to producers on Monday in the New England at the field day we held up there, quite a few people had sacrificed paddocks, and they decided that that wasn't giving them a good outcome in terms of their stock and also their land conditions. So a lot of interest in confinement pens. And another one that has been coming up quite regularly is irrigation and water availability. FMDs has been coming up a lot as well. We had an interesting one in our webinar last week. Someone said that their wife needed to get a job, and then someone else thought they needed two wives to help pay for feed through the drought. So they were interesting ones. So husband getting a job, I reckon that's a really good point. We're all for equal opportunity, and that's as it should be. Yeah, and profitability in the good years. That's a really good one, and that's one of the reasons that we're really focusing on where we can invest in these good years to get us set up for those poor ones. So I'll leave it there, and there is an opportunity at the end of this to do a survey, so we can collect some more of that information if I haven't given you enough time here. Diversification's just come up. So now as part of this project, there's been some work on some agritourism work that DPI has been doing with LLS, and there's some resources out there available for that, some webinars, so that might be worth looking up. So next question is, what are you going to do in the next 3 days as a result of this webinar? And I guess that helps us, asking this, getting answers for this question helps us understand, whether you're going to take action after listening to this webinar, and it also creates a bit of accountability. It gives you something to think about in the next couple of days, so that you don't just jump off this webinar and forget all about it and go back to whatever you had planned for tomorrow. So it's good to just pick something that you were interested in. It might be like this one, turn on aeration fans. But yeah, it's good just to reflect on what we've heard today and think about things that might make your system a bit better. Inspect silo infrastructure and clean out my storage. There's some really good ones coming on here.
Can I jump in there and respond to some of them?
Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
I got a graph in another presentation. I didn't include it today, but in terms of the clean out, in the cooler time of the year when insect reproduction is really slow and they're not flying around and moving, is the perfect time to clean up your grain storage. So coming into winter, before we get to spring in particular, is a really ideal time to do a big cleanup. Yeah,
that's a great one. And I just noticed cleanup around bags came up, and I know I was speaking to an LLS biosecurity officer yesterday, and he said that the pigs are really chasing protein at the moment, so they're really chasing grain. So cleaning up around bags is going to be a good option. Invest dollars in storage. That's good. And further research options. And that's what a lot of these events are really about. Sowing that seed and getting you to think about options and do further research, because we can't give you all the answers. And I like this one, rob a bank to buy storage. I don't think that's something that we'll support as a good idea, but if that's what you've got to do, I guess that's what you've got to do. So we'll leave it there. I'm just opening another survey. So this survey is to provide information back to both New South Wales Farmers and DPI on, I guess, the success of this program. So with all events like tonight's, they're funded externally, and our funders want to know that money's being spent wisely, and so do we when we're running these events. We want to know that we're hitting the mark. So while you're doing that, I'm conscious that we're about to run out of time on our webinar. I hope that everybody tonight found this event interesting, and that you've identified something that you can implement in your own farm. And again, I'd like to thank Andrew and Chris for giving up their time tonight. I think it's been a really worthwhile, and I know I've definitely got something, or a couple of things out of it that I'd like to implement at home. So I'd like to thank you both. If people could just stay on it for a bit longer, you don't have to stay on the webinar, but just jump onto that survey and get that done. That'd be great. And just wish you all good rest of your afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you at the next event.